This is a tremendous evening, and I'm so very proud to be here. All of us in the Faculty of Arts are very proud of this particular event, which is the very first lecture of the Muslim Cultures Lecture Series. This lecture series was made possible by the generous support of the Canadian Muslims for Peace and Justice through funds that were raised at last year's University of Calgary Giving Day. So I'm going to move directly to the plug because in April, Giving Day comes again. This is the day when the University of Calgary sets aside time where we encourage donations that would support events like this, student scholarships, all sorts of activities, and we try to raise as much money as we can. We reach out to the community, and Giving Day is not just about raising money. It's also about making friendships, rekindling friendships with those who support the university, and with participation. In fact, I'm proud to say that in the Faculty of Arts, of the significant amount of money that we raised at Giving Day last year, about 40% of the participants were members of the Faculty of Arts themselves. So, we're committed within our own faculty to philanthropy, and we very much encourage and are appreciative of the kinds of philanthropic efforts that made tonight possible. So, Giving Day this year is April 23rd. You can support whatever events you like. In fact, we can start taking gifts at the beginning of April, and gifts will be matched. So if you give a significant donation until the funds run out, there is a matching that is available. So up to $2,500. If you give $2,500, that donation turns into a $5,000 donation. So it's a tremendous event. Now, again, this is the first in a series that we're really looking forward to at the University of in Muslim cultures. We have committed to teaching Arabic language and Muslim civilizations. We have a program here in the Faculty of Arts that is still in fairly early days. We've recruited faculty members at full-time positions who are doing research, who are doing teaching in this area. It's something that we as a faculty have committed to, but we did so also with strong support from the community and, in fact, from the students here at the University of Calgary. When I first started as dean, a group of students came to me and they said, we would like to see more programming around Muslim civilizations and cultures. We see a lack in the curriculum, and we would like to help you move forward in this regard. And so we talked to some community members. We garnered our own finances from the Faculty of Arts, and we've made it happen, and it's a terrific program. And now that community support has become this lecture series where we can focus on really important issues like the issues that we're going to hear about today. And I think that everyone in this room would share the view that we're at a difficult time worldwide, locally, nationally, internationally. There's a misunderstanding often, a lack of understanding of Islam. There is, in some cases, divisiveness that is intentional, that divides people who otherwise would be able to come together in pluralistic societies. So we in the Faculty of Arts are committed to finding opportunities to make sure that there's strong research being done in this area, that our students have opportunities to take courses that help them to understand and appreciate Muslim civilizations and societies, but also to be able to engage in the kinds of social issues, the political, economic issues that could be seen as divisive right now around the world. And we don't have to look far. We can look in our own society, in our own backyard. We could look at Quebec and Bill 21. We can look at the immigration policies of our neighbors to the south. We can look at the situation, the terrible situation that's occurring in India right now. So all around the world, there's a divisiveness, there's a misunderstanding, and we really need, as scholars at a university, to be able to focus attention on this. And we also need to engage with the community and make sure that the community, the Muslim community, the non-Muslim community, understands and appreciates these challenges. So that's one of the main things that we really wanted to do here with this lecture tonight. And I think it ties in also very well with another initiative we have in the Faculty of Arts and at the University of Calgary, and that is that we're working towards launching what will be really one of the first certificate programs in pluralism and global citizenship. We want to encourage an understanding of pluralism, the values of a pluralistic society, and what it means to be a global citizen, because these issues go beyond the boundaries of our own nation. So again, an event like tonight is absolutely important in advancing causes and in really speaking to the values that we have as a Faculty of Arts. When we launched our strategic plan a couple of years ago, one of the key themes there is inclusion, diversity, and global citizenship. And so we see these kinds of efforts very much in line with our values as a faculty. So with no further ado, I would like to introduce our faculty member, a stunning faculty member who is going to introduce today's fabulous speaker. Dr. Abdi Kazimapur is a professor of sociology, and he holds a research chair in ethnic studies here at the University of Calgary. Dr. Kazimapur's research is in two main areas: the socioeconomic experiences of immigrants in Canada and the sociocultural developments in the Middle East, and he's published widely in both of these areas. His book, The Muslim Question in Canada, A Story of Segmented Integration, published by UBC Press in 2014, received the 2015 John Porter Excellence Award from the Canadian Sociological Association. He's currently working on a new book titled Sacred as Secular, Secularization Under Theocracy in Iran. Again, a very timely topic. Commentaries and interviews about his work have appeared in a variety of news media, including the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, the Winnipeg Free Press, the Vancouver Sun, and so on. He's a dedicated teacher and mentor of students. He's an active scholar nationally and internationally, and I can think of no better colleague than Dr. Kazimapur to introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening. It's wonderful to see so many people here in a late day event. From time to time, we have our end of term celebration, but the room is never this full, so that's great to see that. It's a great pleasure for me and honor to be introducing Dr. Asani, that I have been following his works for a long time. I have this difficult task of trying to do justice to Dr. Asani's accomplishments and contributions, but leave some time for his own talk as well. So I will try to be very brief. To fully appreciate Dr. Asani's contribution, I think we need to keep in mind two recent developments. Recent means in the past couple of decades. These developments are sociocultural, intellectual, political, and Dr. Asani's work is located at the intersection of these two developments. One is the fact that over the past 20, 25, 30 years, religion has been increasingly more significant in introducing social behaviors, political outcomes in different countries. And unfortunately, we in academia and also in the society abroad, we have not been well equipped with the conceptual tools and the theoretical tools that we need to understand and process this phenomenon. So in many cases, we have had some sort of ad hoc responses to this development and very sort of premature responses that have only complicated things further. And Dr. Asani and some of the works that he has done have contributed greatly to sort of ameliorating some of the problems that we are facing in that area, including being a member of a task force by the American Academy of Religion in trying to find out what is the way to deal with religion and teach religion in an environment that is primarily secular and through the institutions that are driven by secular political philosophy. And the second development is, as you know, is that increased level of sensitivity and attention to Islam and Muslim issues, particularly in the post-9/11 environment. And in the conversations and debates that are happening in that area, there are lots of things that are being said about Muslims, but some sort of general themes and general approach that we can see in this discussion is that Muslims are treated almost as an anomaly, as an outlier to the whole history of humankind. They are treated as entities that are situated outside history, outside geography, and do not have any kind of intellectual context for what they think and what they do. And Dr. Asani's contribution has been significant because he has tried to sort of bring all these discussions back into their historical, geographic, intellectual context and give meaning to the things that are related to Islam and Muslim. He has been very active, particularly in the post-9/11 environment in the US and also internationally. I have had the pleasure of listening to him several times in different settings. So he's a very in-demand speaker in contexts that range from issues related to Muslims to ethnic diversity to arts and literature. Dr. Asani has a very interesting life trajectory as well that I think has partly enriched his intellectual trajectory. And that is because he was born and raised in Nairobi, Kenya, and he has been there until the end of his high school years, and then when he left for the US to do his undergrad and later graduate studies in Harvard. He is the professor of Indo-Muslim and Islamic religion and cultures in Harvard, and also he is the director of Islamic Studies program that's called the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Islamic Studies program at Harvard. He has been offering courses, very diverse set of courses, such as Understanding Islam and Contemporary Muslim Societies, Religion, Literature, and Arts in Muslim Cultures, Muslim Voices in Contemporary World Literature, Ismaili History and Thought, and Muslim Societies in South Asia. In recognition of his great works, Harvard gave him the award, an award in 2002 called Harvard Foundation Medal for his outstanding contributions to improving intercultural and race relations at Harvard and at the nation. I know that any extra minute that I spend on this introduction is a minute denied to all of us to benefit from his insights. So without any further ado, I will invite you to join me in welcoming Dr. Asani to the podium.
Well, thank you very much for this really warm welcome. I'm a bit astounded there's so many people here. But in any case, I want to thank the University of Calgary and also the Muslims, the Canadian Muslims for Peace and Justice for making this event possible. Now, what I was trying to, when I received this invitation, trying to figure out what is it that I could talk about. And I decided to reflect on, based on my many years of teaching about Islam in many different, talking about Islam in many different contexts, so educational, non-educational, in churches, in synagogues, in front of a task force of different varieties, to sort of reflect on that experience and think about what I think is very important to frame our discussions of Islam today in particular because of the environment that we live in. So based on that, I've sort of I've come up with this PowerPoint, and I'm going to run through a few slides. And so I'll just sort of go along with this PowerPoint and then make comments. But I wanted to start with something that I thought was a central question that a lot of people confront nowadays in societies that are polarized, and that is this question: why do they hate us? Now, I often encounter this question in two different contexts. One is when I am talking to basically non-Muslim audiences, and I'm talking to them about Islam. Inevitably, there will be somebody, and this is mostly in the context of today, somebody will get up and ask me questions. Well, why do Muslims hate the United States? So why do they hate us? And then I travel quite a bit, and when I've been traveling, many times, like in places like Pakistan and so on, I'm asked to give talks, and inevitably somebody's going to get up in the audience and say, why do Americans hate Muslims? And I thought this was such an interesting phenomena that everyone is talking about why they hate us, but the they and the us, you can just flip them around. But it's the same question. And when you think about this question, why do they hate us, and why this very polarized worldview, you can think about many factors. Of course, some of it could be lack of education, people not understanding each other. But it's also true that the political environments we live in sometimes feed on that ignorance and create divisions in society for political advantage. And I don't need to go into examples. You can see there's examples everywhere in the world about this. But this why do they hate us highlights another very important issue for our time, and that is that people do not have the ability to engage with and understand difference. And we are talking about religion is one difference, and it's pretty bad when people don't have the tools to understand religion, but ethnicity, race, gender, sexuality, all kinds of difference. And I think our educational systems try to provide tools for people to understand these differences and engage. If you can't understand difference, people who are different than yourself, you inevitably, that inability to understand that, creates prejudice, this fear, and so on. But it also leads to an interesting phenomena that Amartya Sen, my colleague at Harvard, points out in one of his books, that we tend to then start categorizing people based on one dimension. That is, each human being is made up of multiple identities. And when you don't recognize the multiple identities of a human being, and you see them only through one label, what might be apparent to you, like you're Muslim or you're Christian, but you're many other things than being Muslim or Christian. But when you see them only through a single categorization of identity, that, Amartya Sen claims, it creates a haziness of vision to try to understand that person. And it also leads to hate. Haziness of vision can then lead to hate, and it can lead to violence. So it's very important in societies that are made up of human beings with many different identities that we should be able to recognize humans as humans in all their complexities and not start labeling them. So my position is always that and I'm sure some of you have heard this, I came across this on a website, I thought it was just a fabulous expression, that you label jars, you don't label human beings. Because the moment you start labeling them, you're stripping them of their humanity. And it's this kind of phenomena where people are just judged on the basis of what people perceive as their religion that have led to phenomena such as Islamophobia, fears of Muslims, fear of Islam, and that has, then devastating consequences locally, nationally, and internationally. But it also has consequences for the victims of Islamophobia. So here, I came across this interesting cartoon. It's called The 5 Pillars of Islamophobia. And of course, what it's showing is this woman who's, of course, oppressed, this oppressed woman. And then there's ISIS, and then there's Charlie Hebdo, and 9/11, and so on. And what this is trying to show is that because people are being labeled on the basis of just their religious identity, every Muslim then ends up carrying the burden or the responsibility for answering why 9/11 happened, why Muslim women are being oppressed, and so on. So that these are burdens that people then start carrying because you're expected to then defend yourself and the entire 1 billion people in the world against these charges. But this also has consequences on individuals, sometimes very dramatic. Now, I put up this image of a woman wearing hijab to tell you a story, a short story about one of my students at Harvard who wears a hijab, just a scarf, and she told me something really, that I couldn't sleep at night when I heard this story. And the story was that she was one day in a mall, and this man, who she didn't know who this person was, he came and he grabbed her hijab, and he tied the scarf around her neck, and he strangled her. And it's only a bystander, she was almost dead. And only a bystander came and intervened and released her so she was able to breathe again. And this man obviously was saying, all these Islamophobic things. But he obviously had this hatred and he wanted to destroy this woman, this beautiful young lady. Because for him, she was this symbol of the other. And to her credit, her mother then pleaded with her, do not wear this hijab anymore. It's going to endanger your life. And she said, no, I am going to continue wearing it as an act of resistance from people who won't accept me for what I am. Now, I would have loved to put her picture up there, but I didn't because I'm just telling her story. But this is an example of something that happened in the United States recently. And then I want to tell you a story of something that happened in Canada, in West Vancouver. These are two young, These are two young high school boys who study in Vancouver, and they got in touch with me because of an experience they had in school, that they were always being asked by their schoolmates, "Are you a terrorist?" Constantly, "Are you a terrorist?" And first they took it to be a joke. But then it came to be a sense, well, this is abuse and this is bullying. Why am I constantly being asked that whether I'm a terrorist? And to the credit of these two young boys, they actually approached me, and we created an event in West Vancouver at the West Vancouver Community Center, where we talked about issues of Islamophobia and so on, but to people from their school, the larger community, the school board, and so on, just to talk about what their experience today is as a Canadian Muslim. So you can see how this is affecting individual lives of young people, and you can think about the trauma that it creates. So part of this is, of course, what's feeding all of this are images of Islam very often that you see in the media. And the media, its reporting, it's the way it reports things, the biases are very clear. There have been lots of studies done on this. Very often, Muslims are portrayed as mostly criminals and so on, and I'm not going to go into all those details, but Muslims as terrorists, Muslims as criminals, that there is something intrinsically in Islam that causes terrorism as opposed to any other religion. By the way, a colleague of mine who teaches Buddhism at Harvard says Buddhism is the most violent of religions, and he cites of all the incidents that have taken place by people who are Buddhist against non-Buddhists, and he said it's quite contrary, and people think Buddhism is a peaceful religion. But it's how things are constructed and represented. And also, this very interesting piece that's based on a study from University of Alabama is that media attention, that if there are acts of terror committed by people who are of Muslim origin, they are going to receive 357% more press attention than, say, an act of terrorism that's done by somebody who's not Muslim. For example, a white supremacist. So you can see that the biases are also there, and partly because the newspapers and so on are thinking about selling. There's a whole economy of, the commercialization of the news. So here we come to this issue of fact versus fiction. Just some figures, and this is based on the study by P. Bergen, and the fact he estimates, and he's part of the he's a national security analyst, estimates there are 100,000 militant, what we would classify as militant extremist Muslims in the world. That is less than 0.01% of the global world population. The Southern Poverty Law Center in the United States says that most acts of terrorism in the United States are not committed by Muslims. And then this very interesting statistics that came out from a study from the Pew and Gallup polls, where people were asked in the US of different faith communities, when was it, justifiable to target and kill civilians? And 78% of US Muslims said that it is never morally justifiable to target and kill civilians, compared to only 38% of Protestants and 39% of Catholics, 43% of Jews. So you can see, actually, based on that statistics, this idea that Muslims are inherently violent is totally wrong. That's not what the data shows. And so if you look at current experiences, especially in the United States and I think in Europe and so on, where are most of these acts of terrorism coming from? So last year, when I was here in Calgary, I heard a presentation by Barbara Perry, who is the director of the Center for Hate, Bias, and Extremism at the Ontario Tech University. And she showed very clearly the growth in white supremacist movements in Canada, alongside in the United States, and as well as Europe. And that there is, in fact, a whole transnational network of these white terrorist movements. And that has actually been responsible for a lot of recent attacks of terrorism. And it's very clear in the United States. And recently I read in the news that in Germany, the government has foiled a plot by this white supremacist network targeting immigrants. So Barbara, her point was that the government is not paying attention to the real causes of terrorism. And in fact, they're so focused on the Muslim problem that they're missing out on a bigger problem in our society. So part of this whole thing, this notion is on this big question, how do you know what you know about Islam? Where are the sources of information? And I've already talked about the media. But what other ways do people get information about media, about Islam? There are many different ways. You can get it through movies, you can get it through travel, you can get it if you know another Muslim, you get information about Islam. There are many different school systems, universities, colleges, and so on. But how is that knowledge actually being constructed is very important. So for that, I always like to use this cartoon about this elephant and these blindfolded people who are trying to describe what the elephant is. So the point of this cartoon, you can read it in many different ways, but what it's trying to show is that people have one tool, because they're blindfolded, they have one tool to use to describe the elephant, and that's the sense of touch. And their idea of what the elephant is based on where they're situated vis-a-vis the elephant, what I would call situatedness. So somebody who is near the trunk says, oh, it's like a snake, or somebody who is near the ear says it's like a fan. So they all come up with very different definitions. And their definitions, and if you'd imagine a debate amongst them, they would totally disagree. No, I'm telling you it's a fan, and no, I'm telling you it's a spear, and no, I'm telling you it's a rope. They'll all have very different definitions because their experience and their tools that they're using lead them to a certain conclusion. But if you remove the blindfold, and you give them another set of tools, they would actually see the elephant in a very different way. Oh, I could understand why all these people are coming up with different ways of defining the elephant. So knowledge is very much influenced by the situatedness of the person. So every person is situated in a particular context, And your context and the tools that you use shape how you construct knowledge. And this is very important because this is where this idea of religious literacy comes in. That because if people lack the tools, because maybe they have not been exposed to them, they've been, in a way, blindfolded, they're not aware of them. So if people don't have the tools to understand religion, they're going to come up with all kinds of constructions of religion which are going to, which lead them to illiteracy. And here I'm citing the work of my colleague at Harvard, Diane Moore, who's written this book, Overcoming Religious Illiteracy, and where she's looking at how should we be teaching religion in a responsible manner in school systems. So we are not trying to promote a particular religion, we are studying religion as a phenomena. And she argues that in this book, three major points she makes: that there is a global illiteracy about religion, because religion is never taken seriously in our educational curriculum, starting from grade school, if not earlier, all the way through to university. We ask our students to be literate about math, about science, about computers, finance, but we don't ask our students to be literate about religion. Why not? Because religion is such an important marker of human difference that if we don't provide education about religion, we are actually failing to provide this crucial tool. And she said that the most troubling consequences of this religious illiteracy, it not only fuels prejudice and antagonism, but it threatens the coexistence of societies, both locally, nationally, and globally. But it also, I would argue, that it also endangers the process of democracy. Democracy cannot work if you're afraid of your neighbors, who you don't understand. And then her third premise is that it is possible to diminish religious illiteracy by teaching about religion in a non-sectarian way in our educational systems. So, what is this non-sectarian way that we can think about religion? And she argues that we can think about religion as a phenomena that is deeply embedded in all dimensions of human experience: the historical, the political, the social, the literary, the artistic, that we can find religion embedded in all these different dimensions of the human experience. It's not separate. It is intertwined. And as those contexts change, the political, the historical, the economic, people's ideas of religion change. So a person's economic background definitely influences how they think about religion, and so on. And it therefore requires us, on the one hand, to recognize that religion is, you need multiple lenses to think about religion, because if religion is embedded in all these contexts, you need to be integrating what those contexts are. But it also tells us that notions of religion are constantly changing. They're dynamic. They're never fixed. They're never stable. And because of that, what kinds of questions should we be asking? Let me see if I can. Because if you think that there are 1 billion or something Muslims in the world, and they're all living in different contexts, and those contexts are shaping their interpretations of what they think Islam is. It doesn't matter whether they're Sunni or Shia or whatever their contexts are, but there's tremendous diversity. And this is true of any religion. So when we start asking questions about Islam, we should be asking, which Islam are we talking about? Whose Islam are we talking about? What is the context in which this is emerging from? Drawing on what basis of authority? And that we can never, ever use religion alone as a factor of explanation. Because religion is not in isolation. You always have to carefully look at the complex interaction with socio-political, historical, and cultural context. So that means that there is no such thing as Islam says anything, or Islam does anything. Islam doesn't say or do anything. Nobody has seen Islam say or do anything. People say and do things in the name of Islam. Islam is a concept, it's an idea, and people have different conceptions of what that concept means. And those conceptions are shaped by their different contexts. So that is what religious literacy would look like. Now I'm going to give you some examples of how we can think about Islam in a more complicated way that provides literacy about the faith. So here's a map, and it's a bit dated because you can still see the USSR somewhere up there. But it's trying to show parts of the world where Muslims are the majority of the population. So the darker the area, the greater the number of Muslims. So you can see this whole area from, I don't know where I don't see the light, but this whole area from stretching across North Africa into the Middle East, it's all, and going all the way to Pakistan, is all dark. That means 89 to 100% of the population is Muslim. And then, of course, you have Indonesia. Now, this is a construction. To see the world this way, first of all, north, south, east, west, that map, who decides what north and what's south and what's east and what's west? This way of thinking of the world itself is a construction. Who decides what Middle East is? Middle to what? When the world is round, right? But when you put this kind of figures on this, and you get this impression, okay, Islam is predominantly in the Middle East, North Africa, what people call the arc of crisis, there's all these political problems and so on and so forth. If you take that same map and you draw a line through it, you get a very different image. 70% of the world's Muslims live to the east of the Middle East. Now, that map itself is a construction. If you take India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, it looks like, oh, there are not that many Muslims in India. And it's true in terms of the entire Indian population, Muslims are a minority, about maybe 20% or so. But in sheer numbers, what is that 20%? It is almost 180 million, between 180 million to 200 million. That same number, approximately the same number, lives in Pakistan. And approximately the same number lives in Bangladesh. In Bangladesh and Pakistan, they're a majority. In India, they're a minority. If you combine those populations together, you get close to 450 to 500 million Muslims just in South Asia. That is half the world's Muslim population. And then you add Indonesia, which is close to 200 million. See, the numbers start adding up. So the question is that if Almost 70% of the world's Muslims live there. How is it that we think about Islam as a Middle Eastern religion and not a South and Southeast Asian religion? Why do our universities and educational systems and so on why do they not teach about Islam in South and Southeast Asia? What voices are being left out? Who's being marginalized? In our constructions of Islam, the majority is marginalized. So what this cultural studies approach starts interrogating these categories of representation. Who's being represented, who's not being represented? And why are they not being represented? And what is the tradition of scholarship, Orientalism, all these kinds of things that have led to this imbalance in perception, all right? And in a certain way, what role have academic institutions, universities, and so on, what role do they play in this lopsided representation? And then, of course, this influences what things happen in the media and so on. And this map is also interesting because you have all these nation states in there. And those nation states are very recent constructions, 70, 80 years old. And those boundaries, who defined what's Kenya and what's Uganda and what's Tanzania, those boundaries were drawn by various European powers as part of colonialism. And nationalism as an ideology of identity was introduced through colonialism. So today we have nation states that have political ideologies to hold the nation state together. And sometimes they try to figure out, okay, how does this ideology accommodate religion? So today what is important for many Muslims, it's not so much whether they're Shia or Sunni or what denomination they follow. It's in what part of the world they're in. Because the policies of the government, the nationalism that they are embedded in, determines their experience of being Muslim. So being a Muslim in Saudi Arabia is a very different experience than being a Muslim in Senegal. Both are Sunni majority countries. But the context of Senegal is very different from the context of Saudi Arabia. Being a Muslim in Iran is very different than being a Muslim in Turkey. Why? Well, you can say it's Shia and Sunni, but beyond that, there's the nationalist context. Being a Muslim in the United States is a very different experience than being a Muslim in Canada. Why? Because the political context is different. So today, the key point about what is the experience of Muslim today is based so much not on how the religion and what your theology is, it's based on where you live and the politics of the government you're under. So again, it complexifies how we think about religion and Islam. Now, this kind of an approach you can also take by actually taking words, common terms, concepts, like the concept Islam and the concept Muslim, which today we use Islam as the name of a religion, and Muslim as somebody who follows that religion. It's an identity marker. But if you go back into time, if you look at in the 7th century, and if you look at the Quran, Islam is always used as a term of, in the sense of submission to God. It's an act of faith. And Muslim who's anyone who submits to God. So in the Quran, you have Christians and Jews and so on are in this big category of Muslim because they submit to God. We're not talking about Islam as the name of a religion. It's an act of faith. And this is why you have them, in this category of believers. And this is why what some historians have argued in that early period, there was just what they call the single shahada, the belief in the one God. And you see this very clearly in the Quran. And Muhammad Asad, a Quran translator, actually claims that in the Quran, when you come across words like Islam and Muslim, we shouldn't project later constructions of Islam as the name of a religion and so on onto the text, because the text doesn't mean it. In the 7th century, there wasn't that conception. And so he said this institutionalized form, the ideological form, was not what was there in the 7th century. How did that construction of Islam emerge as an ideology of identity? This is, by the way, just an example of a Quranic text that is trying to show how Abraham, Moses, they're all called Muslims. So here it says, we believe in God and what has been revealed to us and what was revealed to Abram, Ismail, Isaac, Jacob, and the tribes, in what was given to Moses, Jesus, and the prophets from the Lord. We make no distinction between one and another amongst them. To him, God, do we submit. Literally in Arabic, to him, God, we are Muslims. Before God, we are Muslims, we are submitters. That is the vision that you had in the 7th century. In the 8th century, we find a shift in certain circles. In certain circles, you see a shift in the meaning of this term, where you get Islam and Muslims are being, the meaning of this term is being reinterpreted, especially in the Umayyad dynasty. And you get the emergence of what's called the double shahada, that which there's no God but God and Muhammad is his messenger. The idea being to distinguish those who are following the Prophet Muhammad as opposed to those who are following the other prophets. Why would somebody want to distinguish between the two groups? Power. Because the idea becomes, you get this idea of, you get the rise of an imperial state. You get the rise of an imperial state, and that imperial state was based on an ideology of political expansion. And what they did as part of their political expansion, they appropriated religious justification for this political expansion. Any form of imperialism needs justification. The idea is that we are the latest, so we are the best. And so we have the right to rule people. So you start finding terms like jihad being reinterpreted. So at the time of the Prophet, jihad had many different meanings. So here, for example, it meant people who are defending themselves against attacks from non-Muslims. And when they came back from one of these attacks, this is again in the tradition, the Prophet said, well, you've come back from the small jihad to the great jihad, the jihad against yourself, against your ego. Or you have, jihad defined as looking as a struggle. The struggle to look after one's parents is defined in some hadith as a jihad. And so when a person says he wants to go on a jihad, there's a hadith text that says, are your parents still alive? And when he says yes, he's told, then strive to look after them. That is your jihad. The term jihad had many, many different meanings. This, under the Umayyads, when they start building this empire, is used as justification for empire building. And you get jihad as an imperial ideology that's asserting the rights of some people to rule over other people. And it means a fundamental rereading of Quranic texts. And this idea of a Dar al-Islam and a Dar al-Harb has a political context to it. Interestingly, this is similar to what happens in Christian circles with crusade, where Christianity becomes evoked as religion of empire. So here's another example of this cultural studies approach. In 1979, when the Soviet Union took over the took over Afghanistan, jihad was used as an ideology of US foreign policy to get rid of the Soviet Union. So here is Ronald Reagan receiving Afghan mujahideen in the Oval Office, and he says, these gentlemen are the moral equivalents of America's founding fathers. Now, I bring a very recent example, but to show you that historically, if you look at the word jihad in different contexts, as the political context changes, the historic context changes, you find the term keeps on changing meaning. So you can do a whole study of jihad through the ages and who's appropriated it and for what purpose. This is the cultural studies method. Now, one more thing I wanted to talk about, and then we'll sort of do some concluding remarks, because lots of people have questions. They always ask about women and Islam. And it always comes around this issue of the veil, the hijab. Is it oppressive? Is it liberating? And so on. And I came across this interesting cartoon again, talking about cultural misunderstanding. Here's this woman in a bikini looking at the woman in a total burqa and saying, everything covered but her eyes, what a cruel male-dominated culture. And this woman in the burqa saying, everything, nothing covered but her eyes because she's wearing the shades. What a male-dominated culture. Now, this is, one way of trying to sort of talk about differences on what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. But it's interesting how women have actually ended up, whether we are talking about women in Western societies or women in Muslim societies, they have become, in the current context, women's bodies have become, in the current context, the arena where ideological battles are being fought over. Different people with different visions of society project them onto women's bodies. And this is certainly the case in Muslim societies. So, and then religion gets involved into this. So here's Benazir Bhutto, who talks about Islam from her perspective is an egalitarian religion. The Quran, she says, doesn't discriminate against women. And there are Muslim women, by the way, who would disagree with this. But she claims that it is really the existing political ideologies in a particular country upholding a reactionary interpretation of the Quran that causes for discrimination against women. So she says it's not really the theology, it's the interpretation of the Quranic verses by certain ideologies that is causing that discrimination. And so the cause, she says, it is not Islam which restricts women, it is not Islam which provides for discrimination, it's men. That's where the issue lies for her. And she, in the speech that she made, actually cited this Quranic verse which talks about before God, men and women are equal. And so she says that the ethos of the Quran is equality, but that ethos is subverted by patriarchal interpretations. Now, some people would say those patriarchal interpretations are, in fact, Islam. So that's where the debate starts, saying who's Islam, who is interpreting on what basis of authority. Here's Shirin Ebadi, Nobel Prize winner. Same thing, she talks about, it's not a battle about the religion, it is a battle, it is the result of patriarchal culture. We need a rereading of Islamic text, or some people would say gender-neutral readings, and that the humiliation that is inflicted on women is the result of a diseased gene that is passed on to every generation of men, not only by society as a whole, but also by their mothers. So she's talking about our mothers themselves become the instruments by what these patriarchal attitudes are then transmitted to the later generations. So she's looking at this as a larger issue. It's not just about the theology, it's not just about religion. Both women are pointing out factors that are beyond the theology, that are the cause of this. So this again illustrates that cultural studies method, where you contextualize everything and you see what the real reasons are. It's not about Islam alone. It can never be about religion alone. So some conclusions. So first I had to share this quote, which I thought was very powerful. Martha Nussbaum. The real clash of civilizations is not between Islam and the West, but instead within virtually all modern nations, between people who are prepared to live on terms of equal respect with others who are different, and those who seek the protection of homogeneity and the domination of a single pure religion and ethnic tradition. This goes back to this huge problem where I started, the inability to come to terms with difference and respect difference in society is the big problem that we have today. And this is what's leading to polarization. Some people feel globalization and the globalization of societies, the fact that we become multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, they're not able to accept it. But it's a reality. The world in which we live is multi-ethnic, multicultural. And so the problem, this is the battle. The other quote that I wanted to mention, which interestingly ties in with Martha Nussbaum's comment, actually comes from the Quran, where it said that God has made us into nations and communities so that you may know or learn from each other. Verily, the most honored amongst you in the sight of God is the one who is the most righteous, knowing one another. It seems like it's from a 7th century text, but how applicable it is for our world today. We lived in a world where we don't know each other. And from the perspective of the Quran, why did God create many different peoples and tribes and so on? For us to learn from this. But that educational opportunity is being lost. So this is all the more important when we start talking about diversity, inclusion, belonging. This is very much part of the ethos, I would say, in the Quran, that's embedded in the Quran itself. So again, how you can interpret Quranic verses in a modern context. So with this, I will stop and open up for questions. Thank you.